Now, next up, I'm joined by Children's Commissioners in South Australia and WA on Close the Gap Day. For those working on better outcomes for First Nations people, today's Close the Gap Day may come and go without much fanfare. With just 4 of the 19 targets on track to be met and a Voice to Parliament referendum defeat behind them, the sector rallies every day to improve the lives of their community. The biggest gaps relate to outcomes for children, especially child removals. For more, we're joined by April Laurie, South Australia's Commissioner for Aboriginal Children and Young People, and Jacqueline McGowan-Jones, WA's Commissioner for Children and Young People. Thank you both for joining us. April, if we can start with you, how many First Nations children are in state care in South Australia, and what's the impact on children and their families?
Well, when we're talking about South Australia, well over 1,000 Aboriginal children are in state care, which of those 1,000 children, the total numbers, that constitutes about 37% of all children in care. And within that 37%, we see a majority, around 70%, are in non-Aboriginal care. So we're a small jurisdiction, and our Aboriginal children only constitute just under 5% of the total population.
Jacqueline, what are the stats in WA?
We have about 3,200 Aboriginal children in out-of-home care, and that is 60% of the number of kids in out-of-home care in WA. Children and young people 0 to 17 only make up 14% of our population. So 57% was the number 2 years ago when I became Commissioner, and that's risen to 60% in just 2 years.
Wow, that is an alarming figure. What is the impact that has on families and children, Jacqueline?
Well, it creates generational trauma, and we are really focused on removing children, and we need to do a lot more about early support for families. And rather than a reactive system, be proactive. We remove quite a large number of children at birth or within the first year of their life. And that is really, really complex for families, but more so really traumatic for the children, who often become disconnected from their culture, their community, family, and all that they need to grow up strong and healthy.
April, what future are we looking at if this trajectory continues?
Well, in South Australia, if nothing changes, by 2031 we can expect that 14 out of every 100 Aboriginal children will be an Aboriginal child in state care. That is the reality if nothing changes.
Are we facing the prospect of creating more stolen generations?
Well, we're hearing directly from our Aboriginal community members, our families that are directly impacted, that we are creating. The system is creating another stolen generation. The statistics reveal themselves of the alarming rates, spiralling out of control, of Aboriginal child removals here in South Australia. Aboriginal children are 11 times more likely to be removed than their counterparts.
Jacqueline, is that your fear as well for WA?
Absolutely. I worked in child protection in WA in the early 2011, 2012, 2013, and at that time we had 46% of children in out-of-home care were Aboriginal. So that has risen 14%, which is about 1% every year. So we're not seeing any positive outcome at the moment in terms of reducing the rate of Aboriginal children in out-of-home care. And we need to think differently about what we do.
And when you say 60% of children in care in WA are First Nations children, yet make up only, about 6% of the entire population?
14% in WA of children and young people in WA are Aboriginal.
April, your inquiry that has been ongoing for some months got an apology early this week by the South Australian Department of Child Protection for the removal of babies. The inquiry heard evidence of department workers entering delivery rooms. How significant was that apology?
Well, that apology was part of a public hearing that took place last year in December and went to air this week. That apology, is significant, but more needs to be done beyond the apology. There needs to be incredible change at the legislative level, the policy and systems level, and even at practice in order to make a difference in the lives of our Aboriginal children and young people.
What sort of evidence were you hearing during the inquiry? Can you talk us through what was the experience of parents when their babies were taken in delivery rooms?
So we do know those stories, and those stories how full of loss and grief as expressed by those families. Families spoke about, parents spoke about the traumatic experience of having children removed in birthing wards, in delivery rooms, being given formal notices in a very cruel and indifferent way of telling them that their child is being removed. Families, parents being the last to know about what has happened to for the case to remove their child. And throughout the pregnancy, what we heard from mothers often was that they were being surveilled and didn't realise they were being surveilled until the moment of removal. They were confronted with a very distressing situation, which should be a joyous moment of a child being brought into the world, only to be confronted with a very distressing removal, and at their most vulnerable point in their life, that we see infant removals happening in South Australia, and I have no doubt in other states and territories this is an issue that is pressing upon our Aboriginal communities, and there needs to be more done to ensure that there is early help and that removal should be the last resort and not the first resort.
Jacqueline, early help is something that you've been championing as well. You condemned as an overreaction the cable tying of 3 children in Broome found swimming in the pool of a vacant house. The owner has been charged, or a man has been charged with aggravated assault, and the matter is before the courts. Now, you said a better system is needed to support families. How are families being failed?
We need an holistic system that is collaborating across the whole of the life of the child. So we need early support for mums when they're pregnant through to having their child. We need to make sure that they are getting the right health checks. We need to ensure that if a child stops attending school, that we intervene early to find out what is going on. We need to make sure we're diagnosing disabilities and other challenges, neurodivergence, etc., early. A lot of these children and young people have got significant challenges where if they could access an occupational therapist or a speech therapist, or mum could get help on early health supports for their child, we would see a different trajectory. But at the moment, we sort of separate the child into the sum of the parts of the silos of government. So education is one part of the child's life and health is another, and care in the family is another, rather than bringing the supports around the family that are specifically identified as needed for that family and that child.
And we don't have too much longer with both of you left, but law enforcement is one of those areas as well. Is there a link between child removals and children in juvenile detention? April?
Well, we can see here in South Australia that we have a significant number of Aboriginal children in youth detention that are children in residential care. So we know residential care is not producing the outcomes that we desire for our children. There is a direct link, and we know the trajectory for our children that have been removed into a pathway into the adult prison system.
And just finally, Jacqueline, I know there's so many issues around Juvenile Detention Centre, Banksia Hill, but what are your hopes for the future?
Well, my hopes for the future would be that we start intervening early as a holistic approach to children and young people and prevent them getting on the trajectory into detention. Detention should always be a last resort. It says that in the Young Offenders Act. It certainly is part of the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And we need to stop funding the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff and fund ways to keep children out of detention and out of home care.
Well, April and Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining us on 10 News First Midday. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Narolda.
Coming up.